Let's start with something that feels uncomfortable, almost unfair, but it explains so much of what you've experienced. Avoidants don't naturally respect what feels easy, not because they're bad people, but because of how their emotional blueprint was formed. For most avoidants, love was never simple. At some point in their life, connection came with conditions, distance, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability. So their mind adapted. It learned that love is something you chase, something you work for, something that isn't freely given. And when something comes easily, when someone shows up consistently, communicates clearly, and gives without games, it doesn't register as valuable. It registers as unfamiliar. And here's where the distortion begins. When you show genuine care, when you're present, patient, and emotionally available, you think you're building trust. But in their internal world, there's a quiet question forming, why is this so easy? And instead of appreciating it, they start to devalue it, not consciously, but automatically. Because to them, if it didn't require effort, tension, or uncertainty, it must not be worth much. This is why you can give your best to someone and still feel like you're being taken for granted. It's not about your worth, it's about their conditioning. Understand this deeply. Human beings don't just value what is good, we value what we have to invest in. Effort creates meaning, challenge creates attachment and avoidance. More than most are wired to equate emotional investment with emotional value. If they didn't have to stretch, risk, or pursue you, a part of them struggles to fully respect what you offer. Now, this doesn't mean you should play games or become someone you're not. It means you need to recognize a critical truth. When you overgive without boundaries, when you make everything available without any sense of emotional cost, you unintentionally remove the very mechanism that allows them to value the connection. Respect, in this dynamic, isn't built through sacrifice. It's built through balance. When you slow down your availability, when you stop over-explaining, when you allow space for them to come toward you, instead of always going toward them, you're not being manipulative. You're restoring a natural polarity. You're creating room for them to feel effort, and through that effort, develop respect. Because when everything is handed to someone, they don't feel the weight of it. But when they have to reach, when they have to wonder, when they have to invest, that's when something inside them starts to engage. And here's the deeper philosophical layer. People can only meet you at the level of emotional reality they understand. If someone has only known love as something distant or difficult, they won't immediately recognize the value of something healthy and present. They have to grow into that awareness. And until they do, they may misinterpret your strength as something ordinary. So the goal isn't to prove you're worth harder. The goal is to stop making your worth so easy to overlook. Because the moment you realize that your value doesn't increase by giving more, but by standing firm in who you are, you shift the entire dynamic. And that's the truth most people miss. What comes easily may feel safe, but what requires presence, boundaries, and self-respect, that's what earns real respect. That's what earns real respect. Now, once you understand that avoidants struggle to value what feels freely given, the next layer becomes clearer. And this is where things start to feel personal, because it doesn't just stop at emotional distance. It turns into testing. Avoidants test your love, not in obvious logical ways, but in subtle, often painful patterns. Pulling away without explanation, going silent when things get close, sending mixed signals, or even acting in ways that feel dismissive or disrespectful. And if you're on the receiving end, it can feel confusing, even destabilizing. You start asking yourself, why would someone who cares about me act like this? But the behavior isn't random. It's driven by a deeper question they often aren't even fully aware of. Is this safe, or is this going to hurt me? At their core, avoidants carry a quiet expectation that connection leads to loss. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. So instead of fully trusting love when it shows up, they challenge it, they apply pressure to it, they stretch it to its limits to see if it breaks. And this is the paradox. They want closeness, but they don't trust it. So they create situations that force you to prove it. When they pull away and you chase, they're observing. When they go silent and you reach out, they're measuring. When they act distant and you stay patient, they're taking note. Not in a calculated, manipulative way, necessarily, but in a deeply conditioned, almost instinctive way. It's a test designed to answer a fear they've carried for a long time. Will you leave when I stop being easy to love? The problem is, these tests are unwinnable if you don't understand them, because the more you try to prove your love by overextending yourself, the more you reinforce the imbalance. You teach them that no matter how they behave, you will stay, you will tolerate, you will absorb. And while that might seem like loyalty to you, to them, it can slowly erode respect. Not because loyalty is weak, but because it comes without boundaries. And here's where it gets even more complex. Sometimes they're not just testing your love. They're testing their own belief system. They're almost waiting for you to fail, not because they want you to, but because it would confirm what they've always believed, that people don't stay, that love isn't stable, that closeness leads to disappointment. So when you respond emotionally, when you react with frustration or desperation, or doesn't it just push them away? It validates their internal narrative. It tells them, see, this is why I don't trust this. But when you respond with grounded strength, when you don't chase every withdrawal, when you don't panic at every moment of distance, when you maintain your self-respect while still being open, you interrupt that pattern. You show them something they're not used to. Consistency without neediness, care without loss of self. That's what actually challenges their belief system. Because real strength in this dynamic isn't proving how much you love someone. It's showing that your love has structure, that it has limits, that it doesn't come at the cost of your identity. And philosophically, this speaks to something deeper about human nature. We don't just seek love, we seek certainty within love. And when someone lacks that internal certainty, they will look for it externally, often by creating instability, just to see what survives. So if you find yourself being tested, don't immediately assume you're failing. Understand what's really happening beneath the surface. This isn't just about you being evaluated. It's about them trying to resolve a fear they don't yet know how to face directly. And the shift happens when you stop trying to pass every test and instead start setting the standard for how you're treated. Because in the end, love that constantly needs to be proven is not secure. And the strongest response you can give is not endless validation, but unshakable self-respect. Now, when you begin to see the pattern of testing, of pushing and pulling, the next realization can feel even more confronting because it challenges the way you've been interpreting their behavior all along. What looks like confidence, indifference, or even arrogance is often something else entirely. It's defense. Avoidants don't distance themselves because they feel powerful in connection. They distance themselves because connection makes them feel exposed. And that exposure is uncomfortable. When emotions start to deepen, when things begin to feel real, it activates a part of them that doesn't associate closeness with safety. It associates it with risk. Risk of losing control, risk of being misunderstood, risk of being hurt in ways they may not even fully remember, but still carry. So what do? They protect themselves, but they don't always protect themselves in ways that look soft or vulnerable. They protect themselves in ways that create space quickly and effectively. And sometimes that comes across as coldness, dismissiveness, even disrespect. They may downplay your importance. They may avoid meaningful conversations. They may act like they don't care as much as you do. And from your perspective, it feels like a lack of emotional maturity or consideration. But underneath that behavior is something much more human. It's fear dressed up as control. Because if they cod and convince themselves that they don't need you, they don't have to face the reality of wanting you. And wanting someone, for an avoidant, can feel like losing power. So instead of leaning into that vulnerability, they create distance. They shift a dynamic. They regain control by pulling back, by minimizing, by acting unaffected. It's not that they don't feel. It's that feeling deeply puts them in a position they don't know how to manage. And here's where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. If you interpret their behavior at face value, you might believe they don't respect you or that they don't value the connection. And in response, you might try to compensate by giving more, explaining more, or trying to break through their walls. But the more you push into someone who is protecting themselves, the more they retreat, because now it's not just about their fear. It's about preserving their emotional space. This is why disrespect, in this context, is rarely about dominance. It's about distance. It's a way of keeping the emotional intensity at a level they can tolerate. Think about it from a philosophical perspective. Every human being has a threshold for vulnerability, a limit to how much emotional exposure they can handle before they instinctively pull back. Avoidants simply have a lower threshold and a stronger reflex to protect it. So when that threshold is crossed, their behavior shifts, not because their feelings disappear, but because their defenses activate. And this is where your power lies, not in trying to dismantle their defenses, but in recognizing them for what they are. When you stop taking their distance personally, when you stop interpreting their protection as rejection, you begin to respond differently. You stop chasing clarity from someone who is trying to create space. You stop proving your worth to someone who is trying to reduce emotional intensity, and instead you ground yourself. You maintain your presence without forcing theirs. You keep your standards without demanding their validation. You allow them to have their space without abandoning your own. Because real strength in this dynamic is not emotional persistence, it's emotional self-containment. And the moment you understand that their coldness is not a sign of superiority, but a signal of discomfort, you stop reacting from insecurity and start responding from awareness. That's the shift. Because in the end, what looks like indifference is often protection. And the more you understand that, the less power it has over you. Once you understand that their distance is a form of protection, the next pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And this is where most people unintentionally lose their footing, because the natural response to someone pulling away is to move closer, to reach out more, to explain more, to give more. It feels logical. It feels like love in action. But with avoidance, that instinct often creates the exact opposite result. The more you chase, the less they value you. Not because your effort lacks sincerity, but because of how it's interpreted through their emotional framework. When you pursue someone who is already creating distance, you collapse the space they're trying to establish. And instead of feeling reassured, they feel overwhelmed. Instead of feeling closer, they feel pressured. And pressure to an avoidant doesn't feel like love, it feels like loss of control. So they respond in the only way they know how. They pull back even further. Now you're caught in a cycle. They withdraw, you pursue. They create silence. You fill it. They become uncertain. You try to stabilize everything. And while your intention is to preserve the connection, what you're actually doing is reinforcing an imbalance. One where you are over-investing and they are under-engaging. And over time, that imbalance changes how they perceive you. Because attraction and respect are not built solely on how much you give. They're influenced by how you give. When you give and whether there is a sense of mutual investment, when one person is consistently chasing, it signals something deeper than love. It signals dependence. And dependence, especially to someone who fears emotional enmeshment, becomes a reason to detach. This is where emotional dynamics start to shift in a subtle but powerful way. The more you try to secure the connection through effort, the more they begin to feel that the connection doesn't require effort from them. And when there's no effort on their side, there's no engagement. And without engagement, there's no depth of respect. It becomes one-sided. Now, this doesn't mean you should withdraw completely or play games. This isn't about manipulation. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing that pursuit, when it's not reciprocated, stops being connection and starts becoming pressure. And pressure erodes attraction. Think about it from a broader human perspective. People are naturally drawn to what feels balanced. There's a rhythm to healthy connection, a back and forth and exchange of energy. When that rhythm is disrupted, when one person is always moving forward and the other is always stepping back, the connection loses its stability. And avoidants are especially sensitive to that imbalance. They don't move closer when they feel chased. They move closer when they feel space. When they have room to process, to breathe, to choose. That sense of choice is critical, because if they feel like they're being pulled into something, even something positive, it triggers resistance. But when they feel like they're stepping into something on their own terms, it changes everything. This is why restraint becomes so powerful. When you stop reacting to every moment of distance, when you resist the urge to overcompensate, when you allow silence to exist without immediately filling it, you shift the dynamic. You give them the opportunity to lean in instead of always being the one who leans forward. And more importantly, you protect your own sense of self. Because constantly chasing someone, even with good intentions, slowly disconnects you from your own center. You start measuring your worth by their responses. You start seeking validation instead of maintaining stability. And that's where respect is lost, not just in their eyes, but within yourself. So the real shift is not in making them value you more. It's in valuing yourself enough to stop overextending where there is no equal return. Because the truth is simple. Even if it's hard to accept, when you chase someone who is pulling away, you don't bring them closer, you teach them how to stay distant. By now, you can probably feel the pattern forming. The more you give without structure, the less it's valued. The more you chase, the more distance is created. So naturally, the question becomes, what actually shifts the dynamic? And this is where most people get it completely wrong. They believe love is proven through sacrifice, through appearance, through tolerance, through how much they're willing to endure without walking away. But with avoidance, sacrifice doesn't create respect. In fact, too much of it quietly destroys it. Avoidants don't respond to how much you give up for them. They respond to what you're willing to stand firm on. Because boundaries, to an avoidant, do something that endless giving cannot. They create clarity. They define the edges of the connection. They answer a question they often won't ask out loud. Where do you end and where do I begin? Without boundaries, everything be. But comes blurred. You become overly accommodating, overly available, overly forgiving. And while that might seem like love on the surface, underneath it communicates something very different. It communicates that there are no consequences, no limits, no structure. And when there's no structure, there's no tension. And without tension, there's no respect. This is why someone can overlook your sacrifices, but suddenly pay attention the moment you say no. Not because they enjoy conflict, but because boundaries reintroduce something essential into the dynamic: self-definition. When you set a boundary, you're not rejecting them. You're revealing yourself. You're showing that your identity, your time, your emotional well-being are not negotiable just because you care. And that changes how you're perceived, because now the connection is no longer one-sided. It's no longer something they can step in and out of without awareness. There's a presence to you, a groundedness, a sense that being in your life requires a certain level of respect. And here's the deeper psychological truth. Avoidants may resist emotional closeness, but they are highly attuned to strength. Not aggressive strength, not control, but quiet, consistent self-respect. They notice when you don't overreact. They notice when you don't chase. But more than anything, they notice when you don't abandon yourself. Because on some level, that's what they've had to learn to do. Protect themselves at all costs. So when they encounter someone who can stay open, but still maintain boundaries, it creates a different kind of safety. Not the overwhelming kind that feels consuming, but the grounded kind that feels stable. And stability for an avoidant is rare. Now, this doesn't mean every boundary will be welcomed. In fact, some will be challenged. Some may even push them further away temporarily. But that reaction isn't failure. It's friction. It's the system adjusting to a new reality where your presence is no longer unconditional in the way it once was. And over time, that friction creates awareness. Because when someone realizes they can lose access to you, not through drama, but through your quiet withdrawal of availability, they begin to reevaluate, not just you, but their own behavior within the connection. And that's where respect begins to rebuild. Philoso, thickly, boundaries are the bridge between love and self-respect. Without them, love becomes self-erasure. With them, love becomes a choice, something given freely but not endlessly. So the goal isn't to love less. It's to love with structure, to care without collapsing, to remain open without becoming available to everything. Because in the end, people don't respect how much you sacrifice. They respect how clearly you define what you will and will not accept. And when you've gone through all of this, the confusion, the distance, the testing, the imbalance, the need to rediscover your own boundaries, you arrive at a final realization that changes everything. If you allow it to land fully, you were never being rejected in the way you thought. You were being misunderstood. Because when someone pulls away, when they become inconsistent or emotionally unavailable, the instinct is to internalize it, to question your value, to wonder what you did wrong, what you could have done better, how you could have been more, given more, fixed more. But that entire line of thinking is built on a false assumption that their behavior is a reflection of your worth. And it isn't. It's a reflection of their capacity. Avoidants don't experience connection the way you might, where you see closeness as something grounding. They may experience it as something overwhelming. Where you feel safety and emotional presence, they may feel pressure. Where you move toward depth, they instinctively move toward distance. So when the connection reaches a certain intensity, it's not that you become less valuable, it's that the experience itself exceeds what they currently know how to hold. And instead of recognizing that limitation internally, it often gets projected outward through withdrawal, through mixed signals, through behavior that feels confusing or even hurtful. But the root of it isn't ejection. It's misalignment. You're offering something real, something consistent, something emotionally available. And they're trying to process it through a system that was never designed to receive it easily. That's the disconnect. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You stop chasing clarity from someone who doesn't have it. You stop trying to earn stability from someone who hasn't built it within themselves. You stop measuring your worth based on how well someone else can meet you, because you realize it was never a fair measurement to begin with. This doesn't mean you excuse the behavior. It doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect or inconsistency. Understanding is not the same as acceptance. It simply means you stop personalizing what was never truly about you. And that distinction is where your power returns. Because when you no longer see their distance as a statement about your value, you stop reacting from insecurity. You stop over-explaining, over-giving, overextending. You begin to stand in something much more stable, self-recognition. You know what you bring. You know how you show up. And you no longer need someone else's emotional availability to validate that. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. Every relationship is limited by the least emotionally available person in it. Not because that person has more power, but because they set the ceiling for how much depth can exist. So if someone cannot meet you at the level you're offering, it doesn't mean you lower yourself. It means you recognize the limit and you decide what you're willing to accept within it. That's maturity. That's awareness. And that's what allows you to step out of cycles that would otherwise keep repeating. Because the goal was never to make someone understand your value. The goal is to be rooted enough in it that you don't stay where it's consistently miss you. Understood. And when you reach that point, something becomes very clear, very simple, and very powerful. You're not hard to love. They're just not ready to love you the way you deserve. As you step back and look at everything we've unpacked here, the distance, the testing, the mixed signals, the moments of disrespect, you start to see a pattern that is far less personal than it once felt. What seemed confusing begins to make sense. What felt like rejection begins to reveal itself as limitation. And what once made you question your worth starts to clarify your standards. Because this was never just about them. It was about what you were willing to tolerate, what you were willing to chase, and how much of yourself you were willing to lose in the process of trying to be understood by someone who wasn't ready to understand you. Avoidants don't disrespect you because you lack value. They do it because closeness challenges something unresolved within them. They test your love because they don't fully trust it. They pull away because they don't yet know how to stay. And if you don't see that clearly, you'll spend your time trying to fix a dynamic that was never yours to fix. But once you do see it, once you recognize the patterns for what they are, you stop reacting blindly and you start responding with intention. You start chasing and you start choosing. You stop overgiving and you start balancing. You stop proving and you start standing. Because real power in relationships isn't about holding on tighter. It's about knowing when to hold your ground. And the truth is, love was never meant to feel like something you have to constantly earn. It's meant to meet you, not test you endlessly. It's meant to expand you, not diminish you. So the question isn't whether they'll finally see your worth. The question is, will you? Because the moment you fully recognize it, you stop settling for confusion, you stop negotiating your boundaries, and you stop calling inconsistency connection. And that's where everything changes. Because in the end, the strongest position you can ever stand in is not convincing someone to love you better. It's refusing to stay where love feels like something you have to survive.